Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the United States and around the world, and I give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. I'm pleased today to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Jon Epstein, for our weekly episode called Inside Bird Flu, where we discuss the latest news about the H5N1 epidemic in the US and around the world. Thanks for joining me, Jon.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
All right. So our topic today is one from around the world, from extremely far away across the border in Canada. And it's a story about that got some attention about the past week about ostriches and Dr. Oz, who is currently the director of the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services in the Trump administration. And there was some news, a lot of publicity about how Dr. Oz was following a bird flu outbreak occurring on a Canadian ostrich farm and pleading with the farm owners and I assume government officials in Canada to allow him to rescue those ostriches and move them to his ranch in Florida. So my initial instinct was just to laugh and to say, hey, this is just an act of weird political grandstanding by people who don't really believe that bird flu is a threat and don't really understand how to control it properly. So, Jon, can you give us the facts about what is going on with the Wizard of Ostrich?
There's a lot to unpack here. I hope Dr. Oz realizes Canada is still a different country and not, in fact, part of the United States at this point. So
it's the 51st state, isn't
it?
You
can't just move livestock from Canada into the US. But that aside, let's talk about what we know about bird flu and ostriches. It is not the first time we have seen avian influenza get into ostrich farms. We have a lot of data that come from various outbreaks on ostrich farms, typically in South Africa, where ostrich farming is a big industry. So we do know that ostriches are susceptible to different strains of avian influenza, including H5N1. And symptoms or signs really can range from mild to severe. In adult ostriches, they get things like loss of appetite, anorexia, they stop eating, they can get central nervous system disease, and obviously mortality is one outcome of infection. And just like on poultry farms, a standard approach to controlling influenza infections on ostrich farms is to cull or depopulate the farm. That's really the best way to make sure that the infection is gone, that if you're bringing new stock onto the farm, you're not going to reinfect those new susceptible animals, and it allows you to completely disinfect all the equipment and the environment where you're keeping those animals. And so the question here at issue is really, you have some animals who survived an outbreak. The claim is that they're now not infectious, and why can't we just keep them on the farm? And that in and of itself is a worthwhile discussion. But I think the fact that, Dr. Oz is making spectacle of this and offering to bring those animals to the US is really just creating an emotional issue out of one where the science is a little more straightforward.
Yeah. So, let's talk a little bit about the science here, about why depopulating, essentially killing off the remaining animals on a farm, has been this sort of global control strategy, whether it comes to poultry or whether it comes to other animals as well.
Yeah. So one of the challenges with outdoor farms, and ostrich farms would be among them, is that wild birds have access to the animals. So these ostriches are coming into contact with wild birds. That may be how they got infected in the first place. So while there's an outbreak going on, not only are the ostriches infecting each other, they could be spreading avian influenza to other wild birds that are moving between farms. And so that puts other farms at risk. Now, when the outbreak is over, you have ostriches that have died, some control measures are in place, and you have remaining animals that have been infected, have some antibodies. The assumption or the assertion is that they have some immunity. What I think is still at question is, can those animals be reinfected even while they have antibodies? Is it possible that they still have low-level viral shedding even in the wake of this? Have they truly cleared the virus? These are not questions that can be determined on that farm, as Dr. Oz would like to use these animals for research. These are questions you answer in a controlled laboratory setting with experimental infections. And I took a look through the literature, and in my scan, I didn't see anything that specifically discussed how long viruses remain transmissible in ostriches once infected. So it's an unanswered question as to whether these recovered animals could get reinfected, or whether they still present a risk to transmission to other birds or potentially even to people.
Yeah, and now starts my little side rant about all of this, which is, this is just a perfect example of what we saw during COVID. And all of these people who are these COVID contrarians are now in positions of power, in the Trump administration, whether it's, Marty McCary, who's the head of the FDA, whether it's Jay Bhattacharya at the NIH, whether it's Dr. Oz at the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And they are the group of people that kept saying things like, we get natural immunity, therefore we are safe.
Right.
The problem is that none of these people, literally none of them, have ever been formally trained in infectious diseases, have done infectious disease research, or even more importantly, ever run an infectious disease control program. And as a result of it, you end up with this very simplistic concept in your head that you were infected, therefore you survived, therefore you are always immune. But
Right.
as you and I know, and became very clear, obviously, in COVID, and is clear with every other virus, viruses behave differently depending on their strain. Humans behave differently at different times. The environment behaves differently. And we can't know for sure that just because a bird survived, it's possible the bird was never infected. It's possible the bird was infected and did develop illness, but you never detected it. It's possible that they haven't mounted sufficient immunity to protect them from future infections.
Right.
And we also don't know how long that immunity might last, even if they have that. And as you point out, it's only people who, with this very simplistic understanding of infectious diseases, simply say, oh, the bird survived, therefore they're immune, and we're all fine for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, you'll notice who didn't chime in this whole discussion was the US Department of Agriculture, which has
Yeah.
the best understanding of avian influenza in animals. And obviously, the Canadian Department of Agriculture has determined that this farm should be depopulated. And, it made me think of, Jay, a couple of other stories that become emotional when it's, farmed animals that are almost pet-like in the sense of, an emotional response to, we have to save these animals. And that is that, do you remember in the 2014 to 16 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, there were a couple of cases of Ebola that made it to Europe and the United States. There was I believe, a nurse in Spain that was infected and lived with a dog, and dogs are susceptible to Ebola. So that dog seroconverted and developed antibodies to Ebola. And even though it was unclear or uncertain if that dog presented a risk of transmission of Ebola to anyone else, the Spanish authorities decided it was prudent to euthanize that dog. Now, very emotional story, right? This is a pet dog, and a person who cares very deeply about that, and the public rallies behind it. Similarly, Nina Pham, the American nurse who was infected in Dallas, her dog was allowed to survive and was quarantined, and they made sure that that dog was not infected after several incubation periods for the virus. So, two ways to approach this. But my point is, these become emotional issues and stories when people really, can sympathize with caring about animals, that not wanting to have to kill them. With livestock, unfortunately, when we deal with large populations of animals, there simply is a risk of transmission at a larger scale. And with something like avian influenza, there's a public health risk too. So, not only risk to other farms and other animals, but risk to people that might be around that ostrich farm. So, even though people deeply care about those animals on the farm, there are other concerns that have to come into the equation as to how we control an infectious disease, particularly a zoonotic one.
Yeah. And, there's a reason why, if you travel internationally and come back into the United States, they inspect you for foods, for fruits that you might have brought in that you're not allowed to, or animals that you might have brought in that need to be quarantined. It's because there are much larger issues at play than simply the fate of a few animals that you may feel emotionally concerned about. There's the fate of all the other animals that are here in the United States and that could potentially be infected from it. And yes, you might save a few hundred ostriches, but you might result in the killing of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of other animals when something gets transmitted. So I think the way I look at it is, I don't know the answers to this question about whether these ostriches are immune, how safe it is to bring them to the United States. But when you're dealing with something as wildly transmissible as that's mutating as rapidly, and that is dangerous to our food supply, to our companion animals, and potentially dangerous to humans, I just think it's better to be safe than to take a risk like this.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see Dr. Oz offering to take some chickens off an infected farm in the United States and bring them to his Florida property, do you? I mean, I think, this is really just about getting some attention for an emotional issue that's going on. I mean, imagine, just to, run the thought experiment, let's say that the ostriches that survived on that farm are allowed to stay, and we presume that they have some immunity, but let's say they can still be reinfected. So wild birds come onto the farm, reintroduce H5N1. Now those ostriches get reinfected, but people are presuming that they're immune. So they're having close contact. Maybe the ostrich is, asymptomatic or not showing any signs. That's where the challenge is that there is a risk of exposure, and you're just assuming that it's not there, and we just simply don't know enough. So it's not really a great argument to say, as you pointed out, hey, they survived the outbreak, therefore they're not going to get H5N1 again.
Yeah. And, another issue that's become very emotional, and again, particularly unique to this administration, is issues about raw milk. And that's because there's a lot of these wellness influencers out there that are convinced that if you drink milk from a cow and choose not to pasteurize it, that it somehow has beneficial, minerals and vitamins and other ingredients in it. I've always personally found this to be quite odd. I think we may be one of the only species on Earth, right, that drinks the milk of another species, and yet somehow it's now being touted. And trust me, I come from a family in India where milk and related dairy products is essential to the protein in your diet. But still, it is a bit odd to say that raw milk is fundamentally much safer or healthier for you, particularly given everything we know about the bacterial load that's found in it and the increased risk of illness and hospitalization. So why are we talking about it today? Well, it turns out there's some new research, right, John, about the risks of raw milk and bird flu. Why don't you explain to us what we're finding out?
Right. So far, we've had discussions on past shows about the fact that viral particles have been found in pasteurized milk, but they were determined to be non-infectious. So even, pasteurized milk is generally safe, including from cows that were infected by H5N1, whereas raw milk has the potential to have infectious viral particles in it that could pose a risk to people who consume it. Well, one of the ways to really determine how long the virus can survive in raw milk is to do experimental inoculations of milk and keep it in different conditions to see how long you can get infectious virus out of it. We've done this for other viruses as well that are foodborne and transmitted. One example is Nipah virus, which we've talked about before, where early on, we knew that date palm sap was the route of transmission for Nipah virus. And so we simulated date palm sap in a laboratory. This was in a high biosecurity laboratory, and then spiked different sap concoctions with virus to see how many days you could go at different temperatures and pH and still get virus. And that helps us understand how long a food product remains at risk. Same thing here. This was a preprint that's in the process of being peer reviewed, but it was a study that took raw milk from cows and it spiked it with H5N1 virus, so live virus, and it looked at the milk at room temperature and at refrigerated temperature, 4 degrees Celsius, to see how long they could then get viral particles out that were still infectious. And it turns out that at room temperature, up to about a day, raw milk can still have infectious virus in it. Okay, and after that, it starts to taper off until the virus decays. But at refrigeration, which is how most people keep their milk, 4 degrees C, infectious virus was in fairly high quantities for up to a week. That means 7 days in the fridge, you could still have infectious H5N1 bird flu virus in raw milk. And so this is a really important study because it gives us a sense of the parameters of risk that raw milk can have virus in it, anywhere from a day to 7 days, depending on how it's stored.
Yeah. And so this is, I think, one of the many concerns that we have about raw milk consumption, right? Is that our dairy cattle are now at risk of bird flu, something we never realized would be a problem until about a year ago, right? And so there are so many reasons to be worried about raw milk, whether it's bacterial infections, and now, of course, the risk of bird flu. Now, we also don't know that if drinking live avian influenza virus in raw milk makes you sick, right? Because the routes of transmission tend to either be respiratory, or we also believe, especially with this strain of bird flu, that there are people getting direct inoculation in their eyes. But I don't know if that's a risk we want to take for individuals or for public health, do we?
No, not at all. And remember, the people that tend to be, at high risk for exposure to bird flu from dairy cows are the ones working on the farms in the milking parlors that are getting splashed with raw milk, getting contaminated hands and potentially rubbing their eyes or, eating. And so the idea that at room temperature, virus can persist in raw milk for up to a day means that all the contact those people have with milk that day, is a potential exposure if that cow's infected.
Oh, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that before, but you're right. This has some pretty important implications for infection control, not just for the diet, for the
That's right.
diet of people who drink raw milk as well. So great. Well, Jon, thank you very much for joining us. And if you and the audience enjoyed this episode, enjoy hearing about public health and infectious diseases, please hit the like button, please hit subscribe, and share this episode with other people. And until then, we'll see you soon for another episode of Inside Bird Flu.
Be well.